Hi, welcome to the Certification Kits presentation on how to build your very own CCNET/CCNA home lab. A common question we get is, how many routers do I really need in my lab? Well, as you can see on the slide on the screen, one router will give you the ability to run the commands on it and will allow you to memorize the correct syntax and context in which to run the commands. However, two routers are really required to see if anything works. So what do I mean by that? Well, the Cisco CCNA exam is built around the propagation of data and route tables. The only way you could see this in action is to have at least two routers. Two routers will allow you to see the data propagate, route table information propagate, and path elections. In addition, you'll be able to see some basic device selections. Whereas three or more routers, and you'll get all of those things that we just talked about, be able to experience more complex topologies, and see full device selections. So for those reasons, we really do suggest that you have three routers in your lab. And you may say, you know what, I've seen another video or article that said I only need two routers. Why are you saying I need three routers? That's a good question, and we're going to cover it between this and the next slide. Now, if you take a look at this slide, you'll see an OSPF topology from our free CCNA study guide. We want to configure the environment so we know that R2 will be the designated router. Well, there are actually a couple of ways we could accomplish this. So at a real high level, if we only had two routers, say R1 and R2, we could set R1 with the priority of 0, and then R2 would, by default, be the designated router. But that is not real world, as most companies you'll work for, probably any company you work for, will have many more than two routers. So once we add a third router into the mix, would R2 still be the designated router? I don't know. But by changing the priority on R2 and leaving R3 to default priority, we can ensure that. So I think you can start to see why three routers is our preferred topology, as this can be applied to many of the CCNA concepts you'll see. So let's take another look at an example of why we believe three routers is the right way to go. If we have just this simple two router scenario, we basically have one subnet, and you can argue we could have another one on each Ethernet, so we have a total of three subnets in this environment. Now let's compare that to our EIGRP lab that we have in our lab workbook. This is a 32-page lab, and what we have here, we have dual WAN links between R1 and R3. That could be like New York and San Francisco, so it's a real company. They have to have redundancy here. We have some LAN links here, so you understand the different encapsulation protocols between WAN and LAN. So we have multiple paths, we can have multiple costs on the different WAN links, we can have load balancing, and we can have more complex route tables, because now we have a total of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different subnets, where here we're tapped out with a maximum of 3. So I think you could see clearly this is a much more realistic scenario of what you'll see in the real world, where this is so simplistic it really doesn't get to the meat and potatoes of routing and switching. So hopefully you'll agree in those couple scenarios we just showed you, you could see the benefits of having three routers, and if you could afford it, go that way. If you can't, two routers is still a great environment. Now let's just take a real quick look at some of the features. We have this table actually on our website at certificationkits.com, and I'm going to show you where at the end of the presentation. But what we'll have once you go through this article, you'll see the different models, what the requirements are memory-wise for IPv6, whether or not it supports CCP, the max operating or iOS version, whether it's 15.x for your 2801 and your 1841s, 12.4 for the 1700 series, 12.3 for the 2500, and the different integrated ports, slots, and such. Now, something I think we really need to address, because we've been getting a lot of questions lately, because there's been a couple articles out there and videos about the 1721 routers, and people just want a whole bunch of 1721 routers in their lab. And we don't actually think that's a real good idea. Maybe we could explain that to you quick. You see, it's important, if you look down here at the lab alert, to get the right mix of routers in your lab. Not every router has to have the same capabilities and functions and same features. You'll want maybe one router be your dual Ethernet router, could do your NAT, PAT stuff, and then every other router may not necessarily have to have dual Ethernet in it. So different features, functionalities, operating system versions, iOS versions. It could be a mix of full-featured routers and more basic routers such as you see in the CCIE labs. For instance, the current CCIE lab version 4, it has two 2501 routers in it. That's a CCIE lab. They're just acting as edge routers. They don't need to be, as powerful as maybe the core routers or have as many features. So again, the key is getting the right mix of routers and switches in your lab. So let's just talk a little bit about the 1721s because we're getting a lot of questions on that. Pros, hey, yeah, it is small, it's quiet, and it supports 12.4, and it's cheap. So great. The cons, why I'm not a real big fan of it, it's not easily stackable or rackable. There is this bulky external power supply which has a high failure rate. Generally, when they came from Cisco, they were 6432. Now, the big thing about this, hey, it's a 12.4 router, great. However, if they only have 6432 memory, you're going to have to purchase a memory upgrade. And as you start to add that cost to it, and then, there's some things, hey, you want to make it a dual Ethernet router, just add a WIC 1 ENet to it. Well, that router had a specialized module for the second Ethernet port that wasn't mass produced as much as the other routers or modules, and thus that module is kind of on the expensive side. You're going to be $35, $40 into that module by the time it's shipped and all that stuff. So you may have just been better off getting a much better router, in my opinion, like a 2611XM, and it's more expandable, more features, things along those lines. So what am I talking about as far as it not being stackable, rackable, and what? All right, so we generally have two scenarios for people with their home labs. They're either going to stack everything on the desk like here on the left, or they're going to have a sweet little rack on the right. So if you're stacking it on the left, you could see how these 1721s are, they stack up on there. They're plastic, they fall, they break. You got this big power cube on the side. I'm just not a real big fan of them, as you could tell. At least on these, you can have these nice and neat. You have your 2600 series, 2500 series, 1800 series, whatever it is, they're all rackable. And if you do decide to go with the rack, you got this sweet little setup. You could put it underneath your desk, you could put it on top of the desk, and it keeps everything nice and compact so nobody's complaining, tripping over it, and pulling out your cables. So now, how many switches do I need? Just like with the routers, one switch will give you the ability to run the commands on the switch, allow you to memorize the correct contact text and syntax, and then you could do some VLAN labs, right? Two switches will allow you to see your VTP domain information and VLAN information propagate. You'll get your basic device selections just like on the routers. Three or more, you'll have full device selections, more complex scenarios. Now, every now and then we'll get some really smart Cisco people, maybe they're at the CCNP level or higher or what have you, or really great CCNAs, and they'll say, you know what, you don't really need that third switch. On that second switch, you go and VLAN it, and you can do this, that, and the other, and simulate, everything you're talking there at the full device selections and such, and, some of the other scenarios that we're going to cover. And I do agree with that, but here's the problem. We're trying to understand, or trying to get somebody to understand this from the ground up, and you're talking about $35 more for this extra switch. If they knew how to do this off the top of their head, you're probably already a CCNA, so you don't need a lab such as this, and you've already passed it. But let me just show you what you can do now with 3 switches. So now with 3 switches, in this slide you could see, and again, this is from our free CCNA study guide, we have a scenario which we're talking about spanning tree here, and there's a lot of different concepts here that we're going to talk about. The root bridge, designated bridge, non-designated ports, root ports, forwarding ports, blocking ports, which are doing which. And you can't really do this and experience it in a real world scenario unless you have the 3 switches. If you took one out, it just doesn't happen. If you VLAN one off, again, you could probably do a lot of it, but it just doesn't sink into the student as easily because that induces some other issues. So the next thing is switch features. What switches do we recommend? What ones should we look for, stay away from, things along those lines. All right, so you're going to stay away from the 1900 series. That's a 1912, 1924. The plain 2900 series of the 2912, 2924, 2924M, and also the 3512, 3524s. A lot of people get confused with those in the 3550, 3560s because the 3550s and 60s are layer 3. As you can see on the slide, the 3512s, the 3524s are not a layer 3 switch. Now, a really great model for the CCNA exam in your lab scenario will be the 2950 series switch, and that comes in a SI version and an EI version. Now, EI, Enhanced Image, supports Enhanced QoS, 802.1s, which is your multiple instance spanning tree, and 802.1w, your rapid spanning tree. You could see some of that stuff on the exam. So if you can, upgrade to a 2950 that supports that, which are generally your C models, T models, things along those lines. Now, some people say, hey, the Cisco says you should have a 2960. Why are we not saying that you absolutely have to have a 2960 in your lab? Well, you know what? Think about it from Cisco's perspective. When they wrote the exam, the 2950 had been sunset for 5 years. Are they going to tell you, hey, go out and buy something that's 5 years old for your lab? They want you up to date on the latest technology and hardware. So this way, when you're working in the real world, you're going to be able to, be familiar with that hardware and iOS there. But the reality is 2550, 2560, pretty similar. You'll be fine with either. Now that brings us to the 3550, 3560 switches. They're layer 3 switches. They could route. Really cool feature. I like to have a 3550 in your CCNA lab. It is touched on a little bit. But again, if you can't afford it, not a big deal. But you definitely have to have 3550s and 3560s once you get up to your CCNP exams. Now, something I want you not to overlook. Getting a bunch of equipment and having it on your desk, it's not helpful if you don't have really good labs to follow. If you get, whether it's a Cisco Press study guide or Todd's book or some of the other books out there, the Brian Advantage one, they really don't have that much in regards to labs. They have a lot of great theory, and their lab work or their study guide may be about 600 to 700 pages. It's a smaller size format, and the labs might encompass 20 to 30 pages total. Most of the labs are 1 to 2 pages. Our lab workbook is 450 pages, 8.5 by 11. So there's a lot of information in our lab workbook. And also with our labs that we sell, we include a cram sheet, a how and why we subnet workbook with over 100 examples that you have to go through and exercises. And this book is also over 100 pages. We have our exam prep tools, which gives you our exam test engine, electronic flashcards, TFTP server, subnet calculator, binary bits games, 40 instructional videos. And we have this cool poster we send out that also compares IPv4 versus IPv6. So just getting hardware, if you don't have labs to follow, it really doesn't matter. It's not going to be that helpful to you. And finally, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if you go to certificationkits.com and you go over to lab suggestions and you click CCNA, you'll see all the information I just talked about, and actually there's more information there, and there's some tables showing the various routers, switches, iOS versions, what you need. Take some time to chew on it. There's a lot of good information there. And I also might suggest if you go down to the CCNA Study Center, you will see that we have a free CCNA study guide there. Use it. It's a lot of good information. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to go over here to the contact us, shoot us an email. We're here to help you pass your Cisco certifications, whether it's CCNA, CCNP, or CCIE. Thank you. Have a great day.